Alright, this is video for part 2, the smart how-to of improving the walking, and since the part 1 has been pretty long, just let me have a minute here on doing a bit of an overlap, since I don't really expect that many people to watch the part 1 and part 2 continuously. So we arrived to the understanding that in this particular case, the challenge that we had on April 26th is the triple combination of multiple weakness within this tensional, fascial, rim and spokes. We've seen it at the level of the pelvic monopod, the lumbar pelvic connection. We've seen it at the level of the monoleg, which is the distal proximal periosteal tube, the iliac level, and we've seen it at the level of the true leg, namely the intrapelvic, the hip joint itself, and the ischial gluteal connection, which would be the highlight of the tensional fascial layout, the total soft tissue leg rather than just the bony connection. So in this case in question, on top of all that, there were of course the weaknesses of the muscles stemming from 6 weeks of disuse and traumas, which made the expectation of the walking rehab for this case to last for at least several months and include significant effort and hours and hours and hours of training. So finally, after the hours of preparation and hours of talking about the why, we're finally moving towards the how. And the answer is deceptively simple. That's the method that I call PAVS, periarticular viscoelastic stimulation, where periarticular means surrounding the joint, highlighting this tensional rim property. Viscoelastic, I think it's self-evident because all the fascial components of the tissue are viscoelastic, and stimulation is a stimulation because there is no other way to strengthen anything other than via delivering the mechanical stimulation. So what we are seeing here, we are seeing those micro bounces delivered simultaneously through both legs. What we see at the bottom here, it's a viscoelastic combination, memory foam pillow plus some extra foam pads and so on. Yes, as always, we are back to foam, because what is the foam? Foam is the viscoelastic structure. This is really the key thing to understand, that viscoelastic fascia requires viscoelastic medium to deliver the mechanical stimulus. That's the key trick. And again, it might sound simple, deceptively simple, but at the same time it's smart and precisely calculated and purposeful. So when I'm talking about purposeful, what do I mean? I mean 3 in 1. We have 3 main goals. Goal number 1, as we plan any application, what do we need to be concerned with first? We understood that the legs, they buckle, the legs, they are betrayal component. So we want to bypass those tensionally weakened lower spokes, the legs. So we want to avoid the pivotal buckling that he spontaneously goes into. That's what we've seen, that when exposed to the hard floor, what happens? He just buckles and goes into this pivotal loading of the legs where nothing really beneficial arrives to the top. So that's the first thing to understand, that we need to find the way to bypass that buckling. And on the hard floor, it's impossible. That's the first thing that has to be understood. So that's one thing. So if we draw this image, this is what we want to deal with. We want to find the way to somehow make sure that there is no extra weakening of those spokes, that there is no slack, that we actually manage to deal with the slack, because otherwise if the slack arrives from the bottom and as the load comes from the floor, if there is just an extra slack introduced into the system, what happens? It's slack upon slack. There is nothing good happening there. So what we want to make sure that our load somehow bypasses those weak elements. So at the same time, we have the positive purpose, right? So that was like a avoidance purpose, what we have to avoid, but we have a purpose which is a positive one. We want to deliver the mechanical stimulation directly to the upper rim and spokes. So we want to deliver it towards the lumbar and pelvic tensional junctions. So we want to make sure that the impact, that the source of mechanical stimulation arrives to those weakened areas. And I will repeat over and over again that there is no other way to strengthen anything other than mechanical stimulation. There is no miracles. Mechanical stimulation is the most effective, or to be precise, the only way of strengthening fascia. There are no other components, no other treats, no other sheets that can deal with it. It could be somehow facilitated with, say, microvoltage, with infrareds and so on and so forth, but mechanical stimulation is formative, is essential. And fortunately, it's really coming very clearly through the message that's been delivered, for instance, at the Fascia Congress 3 in Vancouver, mechanotransduction being the key message, the key narrative, that nothing happens unless that there is a mechanotransduction. All the chemical factors are secondary. They could be the catalysts or they could be inhibitors, but they are secondary to the mechanotransduction. So what we're trying to do here now, we are visualizing. So I'm bringing you this help in visualizing what we are dealing with. So this simultaneous impact from the ground, when we deal with two legs as a single one, aims at these levels. It aims at the level of the monopod, of the pelvic monopod, rim and spokes, and it aims at the iliac level, at the monoleg level. So now we just happen to have two of them at once. So this is how it's working, and this is again absolutely critical, that the memory foam has this unique properties. Memory foam has no elastic bounds of its own. It allows the leg to take the neutral buoyancy, just sink in, and that's why, as a result of this, there is no buckling. If we were to put him on the floor, there would be extra pivotal moments and there would be buckling. When we get onto the memory foam, we actually create the situation of floating. And all we need is just to deliver the minimal, precise stimulus. That's it. Because in that particular scenario, the leg floats, so the impact is going indeed to arrive at the top levels. Or shall I draw it in this fashion? That would be the pelvic monopod level, and simultaneously that would be two monoleg iliac level applications. So that's the part one, where this is a double action. And then the next thing that we have to get through is the next source of getting the unconventional results. Well, we need to zoom in further and we need to engage the periosteal tube. So we want this distal proximal response to get at the single true leg. So we're going towards the intrapelvic and the gluteal ischial tensional connection. So what do we do in this scenario? We're doing this. We actually working in a fashion of getting the transfer selectively on a single leg. So what happens here? Original preloading is already there. So everything is preloaded. He has this neutral floating within the memory foam, and now he starts adding the shift of the weight preferentially on a single leg. I hope that it starts reminding you how the healthy child originally stands in bed and rocks and gets the shift from one position to another before they actually start walking or before they start being able to stand unsupported. This is exactly the same principle, but taken to the next level, because we obviously have to bypass the change of the proportions and everything else and the extra weakening that exists in this scenario. But the principle is exactly the same. So I'm just inviting you to think of it in this particular fashion. So these are the shifts from one side to another, where you can see the specific loading, and you can obviously see this other component, that none of the joints of the leg is engaged. There is no pivotal action. No pivotal action at the level of the ankle, no pivotal action at the level of the knee, no pivotal action at the level of the hip. We don't want to engage the muscles in this particular fashion. We don't want to loosen and buckle the tube, the periosteal tube. We don't want to loosen and introduce any extra buckle into it by allowing the pivotal motion. We want to make sure that our impact really goes all the way up to the level where it's supposed to be delivered. And again, I must say that, of course, in his case, we are working with the scenario of a child who has the fundamentals in place. And I'm inviting you to rewatch my video, the 9 lessons out of a single incident of a broken leg, which I've published in February, because over there I'm talking about exactly the same things using an example of another child who has had a broken leg. So the healthy child with a broken leg. So, and the key difference that this scenario has from the performance of the cerebral palsy child. So this is critical to understand, that this is that rocking fashion, the rocking shift, which helps us to get the load selectively on each leg. Again, this is the level of the true leg, the ischial level, where we're looking for the development of this specific division and specific rebound, where the impact that comes from the top then being rebounded downwards instead of moving further and causing the extra anterior-posterior adjustment within the back. Because anterior-posterior adjustment in the sagittal plane, it's the muscular effort. It's not the way that it's supposed to work. We want pure fascial support. That's the only energy efficient and properly mechanically organized way of doing things in walking. So that's very much it. The technical side here, that's what it is. That's how it worked. So these are the unconventional results, and they required the unconventional methods. Again, those unconventional methods, the PAVES setup looks deceptively simple. And it is quite simple. It doesn't take much to learn, and especially if you know the principles of the volume touch and the loading and how it works, it becomes very straightforward and flows organically out of the key concepts that ABR stands upon. So that's just the way it is. And again, I'm highlighting this simple thing. What did we do? We spent a lot of time on figuring out the why before jumping into how. And actually, I'm a big fan of a famous quote from Lincoln, when once he said something along the lines, if I had 8 hours to chop a tree, I would spend the first 6 sharpening the axe. So this is a perfect narrative, a perfect example of how I invite you to think. Be thoughtful, do your due diligence, understand what's going to happen, build up the skills, and then apply them. Don't jump into action without sharpening your axe, without knowing what you really want to do, because it's A, unproductive, B, is dangerous. So that's a very simple, straightforward layout. But if we are to build further on the ideas that I've introduced in the video number 2, the key dilemmas about the walking, we'll actually elaborate on this a little bit more. But here, just a big concept to understand, that we want to stay within the tensional response of fascial superstructures, and we want to avoid muscular engagement. We don't want the muscles, and I'm inviting you to rewatch my workshop in Hawaii, where I've got this long introduction into the difference between the expensive and lavish approach, the neuromuscular approach versus the thrifty rehab where you're looking for the connective tissue strengthening. So that's the same reasoning, exactly the same reasoning. Muscles, you don't want the muscles. Muscles are expensive. Muscles pull things into the pivotal action. Muscles, you want to avoid the muscular engagement as much as possible. Muscles are like super structures, the most expensive structures which have to be used really sparsely and really only when they're needed and really when you need to shift from one position to another. So that's just a change of course. They work as the steering wheel, but they shouldn't be doing the effort because it's too expensive. So that's the key thing. And again, I understand that you might be disappointed by the apparent simplicity and lack of the heroic effort, but it doesn't make it into a story of a movie which we're all accustomed to, right? So where the person after the injury then goes to the grueling rehab and sweats and goes through the periods of frustration and so on and so forth and finally prevails. So here it's not about the brute force, here it's about the prevailing via the smarts. That's how the smart approaches work, by doing what's right and what's necessary instead of unnecessarily sweating profusely. Before moving to the next part, which is about checking paves against the key dilemmas of the walking rehabilitation, let's just get one more recoil and highlight what does it mean, the lack of the heroic effort. Well, it actually means lack of the heroic effort. The smart effort, the non-sweating effort, was about doing these applications for 10-12 times a day, every time at 5-10 minutes, and actually staying within the tensional response of fascial superstructures and avoiding muscular engagement. So that's the total package. As you can see, over the space of 10-12 days, what was it? It was probably at maximum, if we take it an hour and a half a day, well, altogether it took 15-20 hours maximum. That's the power of the smarts. And to get more out of the power of the smarts, let's check paves against the key dilemmas of walking rehabilitation that we talked about in the video 2. So let's get them revisited in the light of everything that we learned afterwards. So what was our first dilemma? The first dilemma was very straightforward: to bear the weight or not to bear the weight. It was actually very critical thing, because as one understands, there are pros and cons. Very basic understanding that without mechanical stimulation coming from the ground, there is no actual tangible mechanical source of strengthening anything. So bearing the weight is necessary, but at the same time, not so smart, the brute force introduction towards the weight bearing doesn't give anything good. We've seen that the brute introduction of force, of weight, just translates into the buckling, which then he compensates and tries to save himself by extra tension of the back, which already was translating into the imbalances at the level of the muscular follow-up along the back. And we've seen that all the time he was losing that balance, that the legs were buckling, the legs were not holding. So therefore, in that sense, primitive weight transfer wouldn't be of much benefit for him. On the one hand, it would have been unnecessarily developing the wrong modalities of the muscular action and overdeveloping the wrong muscular components. On the other hand, it simply would have been inefficient because he would get tired very quickly and there wouldn't be sufficient exposure. So, and any attempt to make a heroic effort would translate into what? Would translate into getting extra tiredness at the level of the shoulders, which would be in turn compensated by the overdevelopment of the trapezius and all these other things, that all the negatives that comes with crutches. So it's a negative spiral. It's the vicious cycle that comes out of the dumb way of doing things. Dumb weight bearing is not a good idea. Smart weight bearing is the necessary path. And as I already said, the introduction of the viscoelastic of the memory foam and balancing the neutral buoyancy is the exact way of delivering such the smart weight bearing. So that's a win-win solution. So in that respect, we were able to use one's weight as the source of the mechanical stimulation, but without the negatives of the pivotal reaction, muscular overengagement, exhaustion, and all the other negatives. As you can see, having this proper answer to the dilemmas of the walking rehab really helps. You really have to make your choices and know in first place what are your dilemmas, and then make your choices. And there is the right way and there is a wrong way. There's a dumb way and there is a smart way. Unfortunately, the intuitive way is the dumb one. That's the reality. And really, I'm passionately inviting you not to do the dumb things. Just invest a little bit into thinking and reasoning, into developing this literacy, and that is going to save you tons of unnecessary effort, unnecessary frustration, and the outright damage delivered into the bodies of your kids. Next thing, do we want to focus on the upper body or do we want to focus on the legs? So I guess the answer here is very straightforward. We understand that we want to get to the upper body and we want to bypass the legs, but we're using the ground here as the source of the impact. But again, the target is purely at the connections of the upper rim. So once again, we are seeing the consistency between what choices we have made. What are we going to target? Do we target the muscles or we target the fascia layer? Now, again, the answer is very clear. We are not interested in the muscles. The muscular fascination or this muscular obsession that comes from the fitness industry and from all this like USDA prime meat popularized by bodybuilders, it's a complete fake. It's such a crazy nonsense that doesn't bring you anything good. Even you look at those bodybuilders, they don't produce anything productive. Again, it's important to understand that the muscles, they are so expensive. It's underappreciated, and the whole development of the muscles is just taken by the people who don't see the background. They miss the background, they miss the fact of the fascial connections which these like athletic individuals have, so they can afford larger muscles on top. And that's a confusion which exists unfortunately in the professional mindset. They confuse the horse and the cart. If the person has strong fascial connections, has strong fascial layout, they can afford muscles which are larger than average. But the muscles themselves, they are like wild horses that have to be contained. If you have strong reins, you can control them. But if you don't have the reins, those horses are just going to destroy everything. That brings us back to the relationship between the throttle and the gas pedal and the brakes. You want to develop the fascial brakes. That's the constraint that has to be developed first, what limits the performance of the muscles. So within PAVES, obviously, there is no muscular action. How do we make sure that there is no muscular action? First of all, because it's a minimal movement. Second, because with this minimal movement, there is no particular pivotal action. You know, when you don't bend the legs, there is no pivotal action. If there is no pivotal action, that's a minimal engagement of the muscles. Next component is that you don't initiate the movement from the level that you work. As you have seen, he works via the transition of weight top to bottom. The source of movement is away from the area where we work. The source of movement, his work is minimal and it comes from the top. He just changes the body position. So therefore, everything here is in the reactive mode. He doesn't start with the muscular action. He brings them into the reactive mode. And when it's the reactive mode, what happens? That reactive mode comes with the primary fascial response rather than the muscular reaction. So we have several layers of avoiding as much as possible the muscular engagement. And that's actually the part of the training. For the person to do PAVES efficiently, you have to really switch off this habitual intent to work locally and make the local movements. Next part, are we going to be axial or are we going to be pivotal? I guess I have already addressed this quite clearly. We don't want anything pivotal because first of all, pivotal means buckling, as we already understood that. Second, pivotal means over-engagement of the muscles. That's what we don't want. That doesn't help anything. That leads to the exhaustion, that leads to the development of the wrong things, that leads to the inability to develop control, and importantly, it leads to the point of being, actually I should draw this in red, right? Pivotal action anywhere leads to what? Leads to the attempts to develop the legs as opposed to the delivery at the top. So we effectively, if we are pivotal, we miss the target altogether. And then we take it the long way, we take it the long way, and we take it the wrong way. That's an obvious choice again. Next thing, are we going to be longitudinal or are we going to be radial? So that's another key component that we really have to understand here, which is quite straightforward as well. When I'm talking about the radial versus longitudinal, longitudinal would be the typical arrangement of the muscles. If we were looking for the pivotal action, we would be looking at the longitudinal muscles. Flexion, extension, all these other things, thinking of the muscular attachments and how they contract within those setups. But the radial reasoning is concentrating on the cross section, and on the layout of the entire fascial tubing. That's what we're looking for. That's why we always expand, and that's a key difference. When you just step on the floor, your point of contact is minimal, so inevitably you're provoking the muscular reaction, and once you're provoking the muscular reaction, it becomes longitudinal. Here we want to build the maximal base underneath. So that's what we're looking for. We want the maximal base and we want to deliver the neutral buoyancy so that there is no excessive sinking and there is no excessive floating tendency. And then once we found this neutral buoyancy, then we just introduce the bouncing on top of it. So therefore, again, what we're looking for the radial perspective here, starting from the legs and of course transiting further into the trunk itself. So radial is our choice, and of course especially when it comes to the kids with cerebral palsy, it's even more so. Next question, do we focus on the long kinetic chains or do we go for the short ones? And I hope that you can see how it all works. Once again, the answer here is straightforward. The moment you go for the pivotal action, you never really deliver true primary long kinetic chains. Once you start doing some pivotal muscular action, you go for the assembly. Even if you claim that you're training the long chain all the way to the top or whatever, well, you have to judge your actions, and if your actions are pivotal, if your actions engage muscles, if your actions engage the change of the angle in the joints, I'm sorry, that's not a long kinetic chain. It's a secondary long kinetic chain, but your primary activation comes from the short one. And of course, as you can see clearly within PAVES, we are looking for the true long chain, where the activation comes from the very top. And for instance, when you look at the way that the entire movement is done, it's coming from the top. So therefore, actually what you're seeing, starting from the diaphragm level, the entire collection of the levels within the lower parts of the trunk, pelvis, and the upper leg works as the extension of the kind of subunits of the singular chain. And I hope it's really easy to visualize. When you first think on this monopod arrangement, then within the monopod arrangement we have the monolegs, then within the monoleg we have the individual true legs, then within the individual true leg we have the short leg, and so on and so forth. So that's how it's working. So that's a combination. That's why it's really essential to start with the long chain and not allowing the slack introduction into it via the pivotal action. That's another really specific choice. Next thing, to focus on the closed chains or focus on the open ones. This answer is obvious again. What is this? This is obviously a closed chain. I remind, the closed chain is the one when we have the two elements locked. Right? So the walking, when you just swing the leg, or when you're lying down or lifting the leg, trying to train the muscles on your lifting weights or whatever, these are the open chains. And this is again the relationship between the smart way and, the dumb way. When I see rehab specialists trying to engage people in lifting their legs lying down as the means of promoting walking, well, that doesn't make sense. This is really a choice which completely neglects the fascial aspect, and which really looks at the paradoxical thing, is that if walking is the closed chain, how on earth are you going to train the closed chain by practicing the open one? That doesn't make any sense at all. But again, muscular and especially neuromuscular concepts unfortunately lead to this line of reasoning, which costs dearly for the kids with cerebral palsy in particular, and actually to everyone who has then experiences any significant weakening and injuries and have to build this through the hard and improper way. Next part. Do we force the fake straightness or do we respect the intrinsic connectivity? The answer here is very straightforward. We are going for the intrinsic connectivity. Intrinsic connectivity stems from the very fact that we are looking for the radial layout and we are looking for the total uniform leg coverage. What happens is, by the time you've got yourself into the memory foam, you are free to position yourself in it according to your intrinsic weight distribution. You are floating. And what happens is that when you're being on the floor and when you're being told put your legs straight, watch the legs, see how the legs are going, make sure that you keep them in the fixed level and so on. That's the introduction of some fake and forced positions. We don't want this. We want the leg to be steady. Axial stability, that's the key criterion that we're looking for. Whether it takes slight turn of the leg outwards or inwards, whether this inwards or outwards turn is different between the legs, whether the foot goes slightly up or goes slightly down, that doesn't matter. We're not looking for that. That's exactly the reason why we're having the memory foam pillow there, to allow the freedom of this positioning. So that what actually allows us to facilitate the loading as it comes through the leg in the axial fashion. And were we doing it the other way, trying to force the leg position, trying to put it into artificial alignment, we would be achieving exactly the opposite. We would be over-engaging the legs and we would not be delivering the impact to the top. So that would be the mistake. That would mean months instead of weeks. Altogether, that brings us back. You can see over and over and over, I'm coming back to this point. Are we engaging the muscles? If we're engaging the muscles, this is the expensive and the dumb way. This is the way when you sweat and when you work hard and you achieve very little and it's difficult to predict. So the smart one is when you engage the understanding of the fascial layouts. But altogether, we realize this fundamental thing. This is the difference between the just do it effort versus going for the precision. You can see that's a micro movement where the most of the time is spent on getting the position in such a way that we would find the floating, we would find the balance. How much do we have to put underneath for this particular weight and for this particular feet? And what we are going to add on top of the base pillow. How we are going to judge the distance from the support. How we are going to support the chest there. How we are going to arrange the source of movement. So all these details, that's what we spend the most of the time. Again, if I had 8 hours to chop a tree, I would spend 6 hours sharpening the axe. That's our mentality. We want to sharpen the axe. We want to really make sure that we've got everything right, that we set the whole thing correctly in the beginning, and then we roll from there. Unfortunately, most of the people, when they get into any rehab effort, what are they being told? Well, cover 200 meters in walking, or cover 300 meters in crawling, or make even like 3 kilometers in walking. Gee, where is quality here? Where is the setup? So this is purely just do it effort, and unfortunately that's not the smart way. So next thing, we're getting on to the next point, which is the no pain, no gain versus the accumulated micro impacts. And again, I already highlighted this protocol that we actually exercised here, that this was the scenario where we really looked for the non-engagement of the muscles. That's why it was 10-12 times a day at 5-10 minutes. That was it. Because when you go beyond it, you've seen that in his scenario, he was going into the buckling straight away, right? So therefore, there was not much to hold. So in that particular situation, we really wanted to make sure that we don't engage the muscles. So we stay within the situation when once he feels any engagement of the muscles, once he is out of this fascial connectivity, once the creep into fascia set too far, we have to take a break and rest. And then repeat, and then repeat, and then repeat. So it's frequency with the micro impacts as opposed to the major singular effort. So that's how it all works. And of course, the sum total of this is that what we're looking for. Are we looking at those clocking kilometers, trying to force the function via the brute force effort, or are we actually being smart and delivering the precise build of the key connections? And I believe that the choice that we've made is very clear, and the results are very clear as well. So that's more or less the story. That's the set of lessons that we can take out of it. So the smart approach has its own rewards. We get the results, and we get the results fast. Walking being restored in days instead of expected months. And instead of doing it the hard way, getting it the easy way. Well, I guess for those of you who've been with us for long enough, it's kind of an unusual message, because you tend to think of ABR as of doing the things the hard way. This is a good opportunity to illustrate that this is not the case. We want to do the things the right way. We want to do them thoroughly and by paying attention to the right choices. When we have the cases when the deficit is not profound, is not enormous, tremendous and mind-boggling as it is in, for instance, a quadriplegic cerebral palsy child, then the SMART options offered by ABR work pretty well. And they work fast, surprisingly, for you. And that's one of the reasons actually why I wanted to bring this case as the illustration to help you understand this. So that it's not about ABR as such, it's about the extent of deficit that exists in your kids. And after saying thanks for staying with me for this video, let me proceed further onto this disclaimer for the parents of kids with cerebral palsy, because at this point you might be asking yourself a number of questions, like saying, oh wow, like if this PAVES works so fast, why don't we get PAVES for our kids? Well, the answer is exactly in this previous paragraph, that PAVES requires the critical factors to be in place in order to be effective. It's a higher level method. It's not that profound and deep. It's integrative, but it doesn't reach towards the profound deficit. If the deficit is below a certain critical level, PAVES doesn't have enough capacity to get into it. This is the example of the child who's been fundamentally healthy and had the local damages, local injuries. This is the key question that we have to ask ourselves. Critical factor. What's the topmost tensional rim and spokes level that weakened as a result of an injury? So in his case, those were just traumas to the musculoskeletal system. In your cases, it's much further. So unfortunate reality of the cerebral palsy is that the fascial weakness belongs all the way up to the very top core, to the dural tube, all the way to the intracranial and the intravertebral structures. That's the challenge. That's the extent of a deficit. It's not that ABR works slowly. ABR could work very fast. It's the deficit that you have to build, that you face. That's a significant part. But the only way you have it is to be smart. And that's why you really benefit from seeing this succession, because in this scenario we have the healthy child who has the weakness induced at the level of the pelvic monopod, and then going further at the level of the iliac weaknesses at the level of the ischial gluteal weaknesses. But to visualize it, I'm just giving first the highest level, and the highest level here has been the level of the pelvic monopod. But in the cerebral palsy scenario, the fascia weakness starts all the way at the topmost fascia monopod level, and then goes everywhere. So if his scenario of weakness was this, a typical quadriplegic child scenario looks like this. I mean, I understand it might look frustrating or sort of disheartening, but that's a reality. I'm encouraging you to understand, well, that's how it works. This is what you're facing. You have to face this reality, but it's possible to change it. It's possible to build it. But you need to be smart, and you need to invest in doing the right things. Don't get distracted by the wrong things. Don't waste your efforts on the one hand, and on the other hand, invest in yourself, invest in your own literacy. Because the better you understand how the things work, the more effective you're going to be, because the understanding leads your action. If you just do ABR applications with a half-absent mind, you are wasting probably 70% of their potential efficiency, because you're not concentrating on the tensional response, which is at the consolidation level. So that's important to understand, and this is the picture that you have to keep in mind. That's why it takes long. That's why we have this notion of ABR works slowly. ABR doesn't work slowly. You are facing significant deficit. ABR works pretty fast. But when we face this deficit, PAVES as the method, PAVES as a technique, it requires much better starting conditions. So it wouldn't get too efficient to the level of the quadriplegic cerebral palsy. Sometimes we can use it, but bearing the constraints of time that you have, if we have like 2-3 hours of the time budget per day, I'm sorry, there is no room there for PAVES. You have to go for more powerful methods, and that's the methods that you know, the 3Q, the ball, the egg, and so on, which goes under the label of the transfascial viscoelastic stimulation. So these are the methods that go deeper than PAVES. That's the key transition that I want to make as the lesson out of this case for you, so that you would take several important takeaways and lessons out of this long story and out of this quite long introduction, but I hope that it has been all meaningful. I don't see any fluff and just empty filler there. I think that each and every component has been important and really essential. And first of all, I do believe that this succession, the sequence, healthy, injured, healthy, and cerebral palsy, helps you to understand things better, as opposed to the scenario when you just see the cerebral palsy and say the healthy child. Not to mention the scenario when you see the cerebral palsy live and then have some very vague remote image of the healthy child. So without ever taking the clothes off and looking at the details, and then believing in some signals and neuromuscular connections. So this is important to understand. We have to go for the depth. We have to go for the tensional reality as the most fundamental basis. And again, I'm inviting you to rewatch my workshop in Honolulu, where I really spent a good hour bringing this difference between the neuromuscular versus the connective tissue paradigm. So next thing, next lesson that you have to take on board, that you really have to be smart. It's absolutely critical for cerebral palsy to be smart. It's important for the injured, healthy child, but it's critical for the cerebral palsy, because you've got higher costs of the mistakes, you've got longer journey to travel, and you're facing more obstacles. So you can't afford these stupid moves. You can't afford being dumb. You have to be smart all the way. Next lesson. To be smart, you have to invest in learning. You have to make an effort. And I really want to encourage you to look in the mirror and really tell yourself, when you're telling yourself, oh, I don't have time to study. Everyone can have 1 hour a week. 1-2 hours a week, even the busiest person can find. It's the matter of the dedication and understanding how you can get the benefits for your child afterwards, because you spend hours doing some intuitive things. But this is the important lesson that I want to really make sure that you brand it into your mind. Beware of the intuitive. Run away from the intuitive. When something looks intuitive about cerebral palsy, it's guaranteed to be wrong. It's a sure path to the long-term distraction, and it's a long-term failure. Look at the GMFCS curves. Intuitive path leads nowhere. 2-3 years of age, when the original fire is gone, after that is deterioration. So that's what intuitive approaches give you. Nothing. It's time for counterintuitive reasoning. And that's what I'm saying. If you think, if you have something, if there's a spontaneous thought, if the intuitive thought, well, you have to switch on a mental indicator. If it's intuitive and it's applied to cerebral palsy, especially quadriplegic cerebral palsy, it must be wrong. You have to really think twice and find the counterintuitive mechanism behind it. So that's really the key point. And this way, let me segue to the next thing, because no matter what I say here on the higher level stuff, I believe that the final question is going to be all the same. When can we start thinking about the legs? Well, this video itself has been long enough. There is no more space here. Next video we're going to address it. Next video we're going to really tackle the specifics. We're going to talk about the key indicator of the pelvic maturity, the super tendon. So I'll keep the suspense so far. It has been a lot of learning material, both in the previous videos and in this video, which turned out to be quite substantial. Please dive in, study well. It's really relevant. It's really specifically done for you. I want to make sure that you get the things in a smart way. It's so frustrating seeing the dumb moves. It's so frustrating to see when otherwise smart people do their intuitive and dumb things to their kids, and it's really heartbreaking. And if I have managed to help at least some of you, to encourage you to think of the smarter ways of doing things, I would consider my mission with this video accomplished. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forwards for the next video 5, which is going to be very interesting indeed. So the mystery of the super tendon as the key indicator of the pelvic maturity that helps you to answer this big question. When is it going to be the time? When can we start thinking about the legs? Thank you. All the best.